Hey guys, welcome back to Ohms TV. Today we are going to do what is probably the most requested video on our channel, and that is DSLRs versus mirrorless cameras. We are going to delve into what exactly is a DSLR and what is a mirrorless camera. We're going to have a look at the disadvantages and advantages of both. We're going to look at what makes each of them special, and we're also going to touch on what has been quite a meteoric rise for mirrorless cameras over the last couple of years. Now, we did this exact video pretty much a couple of years ago, but quite a lot has changed in the technology and the industry as a whole since then, and the sheer amount of requests that we've gotten for an update on this specific topic has led us to this point. So we're going to have a look at these, and hopefully we'll answer your questions if you're in the market and looking at either going for a DSLR or a mirrorless camera and just can't decide which way to go. Okay, so let's start with DSLR cameras. So this over here is a DSLR, and it's a very familiar shape of camera for most of you. Now, DSLR stands for digital single lens reflex, and every single one of these cameras works in exactly the same way. Now, what would happen is this camera would have a lens attached to the front of it. Light would enter through that lens, hit this mirror that's sitting right there at the back. That mirror reflects light up into the pentaprism that sits at the top here. That pentaprism flips the image the right way up and allows us as the user to look through the viewfinder at the back into the pentaprism, and thereby seeing exactly what the camera sees. Now, once the shutter button is released, that mirror flips out of the way, exposing the digital sensor that sits behind it and allowing that sensor to capture light and expose an image. This is a mirrorless camera, and on the face of it, it actually looks very similar to the DSLR that we just had a look at. But there is one critical difference. A mirrorless camera has no mirror within its assembly. So what happens in these cameras is light enters through the lens, falls onto the digital sensor that is permanently exposed to that light, and that image is then digitally displayed within the viewfinder or onto the screen at the back, allowing us as the user to then see what the camera sees. When the shutter on these cameras is released, all that happens is that digital image is captured, exposed, and saved onto the memory card. So a pretty simple operation at its core. It's time to dive into some of the differences between these units, and at the same time look at some key advantages and disadvantages of each system. Now, DSLR cameras use traditional optical viewfinders. These optical viewfinders essentially allow you to see the image as it is projected by light reflecting off your subject matter coming in through the lens of the camera. Now, that has some key limitations to it, and chief among which is the amount of information that can be displayed along with that optical image that you're effectively seeing. Now, you can have things like your aperture and shutter speed and ISO, light meters and autofocus points displayed within the optical viewfinder, but that is pretty much it. Everything else that you see is just the light reflected into the camera through the lens, and that is what you view, nothing more, nothing less. Now, digital viewfinders operate on a completely different principle. So as we explained, a digital viewfinder basically displays the information being captured by the sensor, which is continuously exposed to light. And this has some very key advantages. Firstly, you can see pretty much every single setting that is being applied to the camera represented within your digital viewfinder, and this you can manipulate to your heart's content for the most part. By far though, the biggest advantage of digital viewfinders is the fact that you can see live view exposure. Now, yes, that allows you to see exactly whether the image is overexposed or underexposed by looking at the image as opposed to reading the light meter. And this is done by the camera applying post-processing to the image as the information is captured by the sensor, but before it is displayed in the viewfinder. And that's very, very handy, but it goes a step further. You can also view any effects that's being applied to that image. So say, for example, you're shooting in black and white, then your image displayed is black and white. If you have pop filters applied or miniature effect or film simulations, anything like that, you can see the effect of those settings immediately displayed within your digital viewfinder. It also makes it extremely easy for newcomers into a more professional market to get familiar with these cameras and really get to grips with all the settings and all the exposure variables that they can implement in here. For me, it's a definite advantage to the entire mirrorless system. Another key difference between DSLRs and mirrorless cameras is the size of them. These two cameras are very, very similar to each other. Both are full frame units, both sell for more or less similar money, and they both appeal to the exact same audience. And as you can see, there is quite a substantial size difference between these units, both in terms of their actual width and just the general size that's present here. Now, a lot of that is down to the fact that DSLRs require the mirror assembly to be in there, and they also require pentaprisms to allow for the optical viewfinder to function. Mirrorless cameras don't have any of that, and as a result they can be significantly smaller. The difference becomes even bigger when you introduce things like APS-C size mirrorless cameras. This is the Canon M6 Mark II, and it's a little powerhouse of a camera and still absolutely tiny, like really, really great. And it's a very clear advantage of the mirrorless system. DSLRs tend to feel a bit more solid in the hand, especially when it comes to grips. They definitely have that laid out far, far better than a lot of mirrorless cameras have. This little camera in here is quite tiny and the grip is quite dinky and it doesn't feel particularly great in my hand, but that's your trade-off. The Sony a7 III over here has quite a nice grip and it sits quite well, but still that DSLR grip definitely feels better to my hand, but it is very much a personal preference thing here. Now, sticking with the size theme, there is one element that we have not discussed, and that's the lenses that go onto these cameras. What used to happen with these cameras is the moment that you attached a lens to this camera of an equivalent focal length of a lens that you'd find on a DSLR, the size would become virtually identical. If you laid the units down and you had the lenses on them, they would be absolutely identical in size. And that was an effect of traditional optic designs. So what used to happen is the optics on these cameras had to take into account the flange distance. So that's the distance between the focal point of the lens and the actual sensor of the camera. And traditional optic designs could not accommodate for that. In the years since our previous video, most manufacturers have made massive strides in this. And now, even on these full frame cameras, you can get some truly small lenses taking the mirrorless system to that little next level in terms of the size. Even if you go for traditional DSLR style lenses, so we're looking at 70 to 200s and 24 to 70s, they have become significantly smaller, incorporating newer types of optical design to take advantage of the size package being offered by mirrorless cameras. Now, lenses in general, and specifically the amount of lenses available for mirrorless cameras, is another point that has changed significantly over the last couple of years. Now, if you look back at our previous video that we made, one of the points that we raised as a disadvantage of mirrorless cameras was that at the time there wasn't a lot of lenses available specifically for mirrorless systems. That has seen great improvements over the last couple of years. Brands like Nikon, Sony, Canon, Fuji, even Olympus and Panasonic, pretty much every brand that makes mirrorless cameras out there has really put a ton of effort into bringing their lens lineup up to scratch. And there really is almost nothing to separate these units in terms of lenses available for them these days. What you'll also find is that brands that are transitioning from DSLR cameras into more mirrorless cameras generally offer adapters so that you can use all of your traditional DSLR lenses on your mirrorless setups. And that is a really fantastic feature and really makes these two on par in terms of lenses available for them. If we can go back to size for just a second, this is going to be one area where the smaller size of mirrorless cameras is actually a disadvantage to the system, and that's battery life. What you're going to find with DSLRs is that you generally get pretty impressive battery life even out of entry-level units. Even the most basic DSLR out there will happily rattle off between 600 and 1,000 shots per battery charge. And entry-level units such as the Nikon D3500 will run to about 1,500 shots on a single battery. And that's not even taking into account Pro DSLRs, which in some cases can run 2,000, 3,000 or even up to 4,000 shots on a single battery, though yes, with much bigger batteries than what you get in these types of cameras. Now, mirrorless cameras are a bit of a different story, where most of them are going to give you between 300 and about 400, 450 shots. You'll see units like the Sony a7R IV and this a7 III over here being rated to about 600 shots, and that's about as good as mirrorless cameras get at the moment. And that's a serious disadvantage if you're a pro photographer and you're going to put these units through serious work. That means you're going to have to carry a couple of extra batteries, where with a DSLR that might not be as necessary. Now, enough about the physical characteristics of these cameras. Let's talk about the actual technology that's at work here. Let's kick it off by talking about one of the biggest features of mirrorless cameras, and that's autofocus systems. Traditionally, mirrorless cameras had a massive disadvantage when it came to autofocus, and this was because mirrorless cameras used to use contrast detect autofocus. What contrast detect autofocus does is it basically looks at the image that's being projected onto the sensor, and as the lens moves through its focus range, it picks out the point where that image is at its sharpest, so where it displays the highest contrast. Now, unfortunately, this means that the lens had to go past the point of highest contrast and then be pulled back to achieve actual sharp autofocus. The advantage of that was that the system was extremely accurate as it was being developed on the sensor itself. Now, DSLRs went a slightly different route, and they employed what is known as phase detect autofocus. Phase detect autofocus basically looks at two separate images of what's being projected through the lens, and then moves the lens until those two images line up and give you a sharp image. Now, in a DSLR, because there's a mirror in the way of the sensor, that autofocusing could not actually be accomplished on the sensor itself. So all DSLRs have a little separate sensor that actually autofocuses the lens. And yes, the system was very quick, but unfortunately not always as accurate as contrast detect. But everybody wants speed and accuracy, and this is where mirrorless cameras stepped in and really upped their game. So what the manufacturers of mirrorless cameras did was they figured out a way to incorporate phase detect autofocus onto the actual sensor of the unit. How a lot of these cameras work now is they use phase detect to get the autofocus to a point where it's reasonably accurate and very quickly to that point, and then switches over to contrast detect to fine-tune that autofocus and get that critical accuracy that you want, giving you both the accuracy and the speed of autofocus that you want. And that is quite an advantage of the mirrorless system as it stands right now. But that is not where it ends for autofocusing, and this is where mirrorless cameras really have the potential to take a massive step over what DSLRs have been able to accomplish. Now, remember that post-processing that we talked about when you look at all the live view features through the digital viewfinder? That same type of principle gets applied to autofocus in a lot of these mirrorless cameras. So because the image is being projected directly onto the digital sensor, the actual camera's processor is able to manipulate that information and use that to augment what the autofocus system is capable of doing. So if you look at technology that, for example, Sony has pioneered, when you look at when they kicked off with face detect autofocus and now stepping into eye tracking autofocus and animal detect autofocus and animal eye detect autofocus, that's when you start to really see the benefits of having an autofocus system that is being run directly on the camera's sensor. So what basically happens is the camera captures that information, looks at it, and essentially determines what it is that you are photographing. So if you're photographing someone's face, it immediately locks onto the eyes and knows that that is where the critical point point of that image is. And the same is true for animals, cars, and motorbikes, and all sorts of other things that these cameras are able to detect on the sensor. And realistically, that is probably where we're going to see the biggest strides coming out in the camera industry in the next couple of years. That is a massive advantage for mirrorless cameras as it stands right now. These advanced autofocus features also carry over into video shooting, and that's another field where mirrorless cameras currently have quite a big advantage. Now apply those intelligent hybrid autofocus systems into video shooting and you have a camera that can organically pick out what your subject is in the scene that you're filming, track that subject extremely accurately and without you having to manually focus or even really pick out focus points within your frame. And that becomes extremely handy if you're getting into that video sphere. Manufacturers seem to really be focusing their development on mirrorless cameras when it comes to specific video shooting. And you have these units now easily putting out 4K 60 frames a second and some incredible bit rates. You also have some new cameras that have been announced that's coming out now that's going to be shooting 8K in these small mirrorless packages, and that's really incredible. Now there's no reason why a DSLR camera cannot do the same. All the technology is there, they really can. It's just that the manufacturers seem to be focusing all of that R&D into mirrorless cameras. And as it stands right now, if you're going to be shooting a lot of video, that's a clear advantage for mirrorless systems. Now, none of this means that mirrorless cameras have it all their own way, and you actually see a lot of new DSLRs coming out incorporating a lot of that hybrid mirrorless technology. If you look at some recent units that came out, so we're thinking about stuff like the Canon 90D, the Canon 1DX Mark III, and this unit right here, the Nikon D780, you actually see that they really go for that hybrid shooting experience, where when you shoot through the optical viewfinder, it functions purely as a traditional DSLR, but then when you lock the mirror up and you go into the live view shooting modes, they're trying to incorporate a lot of that mirrorless technology into the DSLR framework. That really tells you something about what's happening in the industry right now. Yes, mirrorless cameras are on a massive rise, and over recent years we've seen that, for example, Sony has become the largest seller of full frame cameras, and they only manufacture mirrorless units. They don't do any DSLRs. But at the same time, DSLRs are definitely not dead, and they definitely have a place. Camera manufacturers are going to continue putting effort into DSLRs, but definitely that effort is skewed towards mirrorless cameras, as they clearly see that as the future. Now, how do we tie all of this information together? Which really is better? Is it DSLRs or is it mirrorless cameras? At a purely technical level, looking at technology available within these systems right now as things stand, it is clear that mirrorless cameras are definitely superior to DSLRs. But there is a little bit more to it, and that comes in with personal preference. Yes, if you pick up a DSLR, it's chunkier, it's bigger, it's heavier. For the most part, they are a little bit better to hold, they feel a little bit better in the hand, and they definitely perform better when you have a big telephoto lens attached to the front of them. That doesn't mean that mirrorless cameras can't do the same, it's just a DSLR is a little bit more comfortable in that scenario. At the same time, there's also a lot of users out there who prefer optical viewfinders and will not swap them for a digital viewfinder for anything. And if that's what you want, then that's what you need to go for. But, and I will reiterate this, right now, mirrorless cameras have a distinct technological advantage over DSLRs, and that shows no signs of slowing down. The vast majority of manufacturers out there are pumping all of their R&D budgets into mirrorless technology, and that is where the future lies. So if you're new into the industry and you're looking to buy either a DSLR or a mirrorless camera right now, I would definitely strongly recommend that you look at mirrorless technology, especially if you are going to be shooting video. Then it becomes the clear front runner. But at the end of the day, it is still going to be a subjective choice, but one of them has an advantage as things stand right now. Well guys, that's it for today's video. I really hope you guys enjoyed taking a look at the differences between DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. If you did enjoy that video, please consider subscribing to our channel. And if you have any questions about today's topic, drop them in the comments section down below. We will answer any questions you have. So stay safe, take care of each other, and until next time, cheers.